when you study holiness, religion has used holiness to do what religion does best. We create us versus them. And so if my holiness standard, whatever that looks like, is better than your holiness standard, well, then you have something to live up to, and I am, holier than you are. The actual word holy is not that complicated. It simply means other than. That's actually what it means, other than. So when if you can imagine now the seraphim angels singing, we see this in the open vision in Isaiah, the seraphim angels singing, they sing, holy, holy, holy is the Lord. What they're actually proclaiming is, he's other than anything you can imagine. When you say he's good, well, he's actually holier than what you think is good. When you say he's gracious, he's other than whatever your reference point is for grace. He's better than, he's greater than, he's other than, he is holy. And then is it any wonder that Jesus gives his own disciples the same admonition, be holy as I am holy. So holiness is other than. And we can say it 100 different ways. We use metaphors because our language just doesn't work. But you can say in the world, but not of it. Holy. It is not us adopting a standard of rules or regulations that makes us better than other people. It's literally when people behold you, they can't put their finger on it, but they're like, there's something different about them. What is it about them? I want to know who they know. Why do they still have joy when everything seems like to be hell around them? Why do they still have peace when the last thing the world even entertains is peace? How is it that they still have a pep in their step when I know that they've been through hardship? That's holiness. Something that you cannot produce of your own accord. We carry a holy God in us. And so God is other than. He is not a God of our own making. Not as much as we wish that he would be, he's not going to submit to our own standards. God always has a way of jumping over the fence, of breaking out of the box, whatever metaphor you need. He is going to make sure that he is other than that. And so what I really want to lean into in this session is about enemies and enemy verbiage. And for some of you, this is going to be some review because I'm going to lean into the notes on the enemy's table. This is a message that I first did last year, but I need to communicate some of these truths to help us in this vein that we're in. And so, I just got back from New York. We had an amazing men's meeting as one of the meetings while we were there. And we, as men, we started talking about who do we most identify with in Scripture. Now, ladies, I know it's a different exercise for you, because you've got, it's interesting. Most of the women in the Bible are pretty amazing to relate to. Now, there's a few you probably don't. Jezebel comes to mind, right? So there's a few you probably don't want to be Lot's wife, and we don't even know her name. It's just Lot's wife. But, you think of Ruth, you think of Sarah, there's just amazing women to go after. Now, so for men, our role models scripturally can be difficult at times because they have good qualities and then they have like extreme, not so good qualities. But God still uses them, right? He still will use them to bring about his purpose. He still will strive with them in their place of understanding. And so for me, now you can't use Jesus because that's kind of unfair. If I sat here and there were, 100 men in here, they probably, Jesus is who I relate to. Okay. Don't just give me the answer you think I want to hear. Like, who do you really relate to? And for me, for my part, it would be David. Like, that's the guy. Either David or Peter, if I'm just being honest, because I think I'd make a great Peter as well. Jesus blessed you one second, calling you the devil the next. I think I could probably do that. So David, lopping off heads, going to war, a womanizer, but a man after God's own heart. So it's almost like, hey, you can do these things, and if you just repent well, after all, Jesus identifies with David. He calls David his father. And he comes out of the tribe. He's the lion of the tribe of Judah. Jesse is the root of that tribe. Jesus is the golden branch from that tribe. It's amazing. And then, he even when he's having probably one of the most profound offerings in Scripture, remember that's when the widow comes and brings her 2 mite. That's in response to him actually giving a message. If you go and read that, the message was that he was right now sitting on the throne of his father David. And a different message for a different time. When the woman heard that Jesus had fulfilled the promises of the old, it compelled her to be generous. I love that. And she gave everything that she had. So a big connection there with David, right? But when you start thinking about David, there's a lot of enemy territory, a lot of enemy verbiage, a lot of bloodshed. Remember, one of the first songs we hear about David is Saul has slain his thousands, David his tens of thousands. Now, I don't know how much of that's made up, like in terms of how many people, but they both sound like a lot to me. I mean, if someone came in and said, Flora has slain her thousands, I bet you don't mess with Flora. I mean, she's slain her thousands. But then somebody walks in, oh, they've slain their tens of thousands. Whoa, hold on. So there was a lot of bloodshed going on here. And something that I've touched on in some of our study here is it makes me wonder if there's not this connection between some of the violent tendencies of Samuel, and it seemed like he was joined to violent kings. Saul was certainly violent. David, additionally violent. We have record where Saul would go and lop guys into pieces. When he would approach a city, the elders would come and say, do you come in peace? Like they were afraid of Samuel. And I'm like, so is that God? Like, is that really the heart and nature of God? And so then we get to places like this. In 1 Chronicles 22, David wanted to build a temple for God, wanted to build a house for him. And then God begins to speak. In 1 Chronicles 22, verses 7 through 9, David said to Solomon, my son, I had it in my heart to build a house for the name of the Lord. But his word of the Lord came to me. You have shed much blood and you have fought many wars. You basically will not build a house in my name because you've shed much blood on earth in my sight. But you'll have a son and he will be a man of peace and rest. And I will give him rest from all of his enemies on every side. His name will be Solomon, and I will grant Israel peace and quiet during his reign. So David is a man of war, and he wants to build God a house. God said, you can't build me a house. You've got blood on your hands. If anyone's going to build my house, it has to be a man of peace, and your son can be just that man. Now, we read that, and what I want to encourage us to do, and this is so much of what this series is trying to encourage us to do, is, again, you've heard me say, I'm going to continue to say it. I'm not telling you what to think. I'm telling you that you can think and you should think. How many times do you believe David took life and felt like it was ordained and authored by God? When I was growing up, I thought, well, these are enemy armies, and they're persecuting Israel. And so, of course, God wants them to, lop off heads and take names. That's what he wants them to do. And it's ugly business, but that's what happens when you pick on God's people, right? Okay. So now, does this sound like God? If he tells David, hey, go kill them, they're messing with you, kill them all. But then it gets to the point where David wants to build a house, and God's like, well, you can't, because you got blood on your hands, and people like you can't build houses for me. Wait a second. So did he tell David to do this, knowing that if David obeyed him, it would disqualify him from building his house? Or could it be that David, he was encountering the Rorschach God, a God that looked like him? His enemies are my enemies, right? His will is Looks like my will oftentimes, until you see the will of God on display. And he's like, wait, you're disqualified. You can't even build a house for me. Your son can, you can't. And then even with Solomon, as the story goes, you go and study it out. He even told Solomon, okay, I will come and hang out in your temple, but I don't really do houses, really. So this is the deal I'm going to make with you. Can you hear the heart of God? This is the deal I'll make. I'll hang out there as long as you don't build temples to other gods. As soon as you do that, I'm gone. And what is God showing him? This is not like God being severe. He's showing Solomon, I don't do temple worship. I don't do idolatry. If you build a temple to my right and to my left for me to fit in, I'm out of here, because I'm not a God who fits in. And so sure enough, it didn't take long. You have enough wives from conquered armies that want to worship their own gods. It doesn't take long. And Solomon started building other temples. And then it said the spirit departed from that house and did not return to a temple for 400 years. And when he returned to the temple, he returned in the person of Jesus in the flesh, when Jesus walked into the temple. God does not do temples. He does not do temple worship. He does not do idolatry. And again, a side note, just because I've really been meditating on this a lot in the last week, all idolatry is self-worship, all of it. Now, you can build a statue. You can put it up on one of these speakers right here and bow down and worship it. No matter what you call it, that statue is a representation of you, right? When Moses went up to get his commands, right? And then it says that Aaron and all the people down there, they started melting down gold and they built a calf. That calf was a representation of them. Who built it? They built it. So any idolatry is self-idolatry.
I want to take a moment to share my new book with you. It was born out of my own journey, filled with questions, doubts, and revelations about the nature of God. It challenges the distorted images we have often about God, urging us to see Him through the lens of Jesus. I decided to offer this book on a pay-what-you-want basis because I believe the message of the Rorschach God is way too important for anything to get in the way, especially finances. The Rorschach God isn't just another theological treatise. It's an invitation to explore, to break down barriers, the ones we built around our understanding of God, guided by the true character and nature of Jesus. If you've ever felt puzzled by the images of a wrathful or distant God, or if you're seeking a deeper, more loving relationship with the divine, this is the book for you. Let's rediscover God together, not as a figure marred by our projections and fears, but as the loving, compassionate Father Jesus showed Him to be. Join me on this journey, pay what you can, and let's explore the heart of God together. You can find the Rorschach God at hesterbook.com. And now, back to the Word.
A lot of times when I talk about things like this floor, I talk about the enemy being defeated, or we need to re-examine what we believe about spiritual warfare. People come up with all these stories about, well, I've been in territories where there's dark power and dark energy, and they believe that these, idols have power. And I'm thinking, well, they do. But it represents them. It's literally it's a manifestation of their own belief system. And the Bible is pretty clear in this area. It says, as a man thinks in his heart, so is he. And so if you believe something has power, it becomes powerful. If you don't believe that, go back to 2020 and look at how many people were afraid of COVID. And it's no matter how afraid they got of it, it still didn't stop them from getting it, right? And how many times they got treated and all these things. And I'm not trying to get the politics of it all. But I found myself in 2020 having to, as a minister against the spirit of fear. Now, none of us have built an altar to fear, at least not that I've checked. But if we did, we don't need a visible altar for fear. We carry it with us all the time. God has not given us a spirit of fear, but a power, love, and a sound mind. I don't know how I got on all that. So again, David, man of war, uses enemy verbiage often. And he does it all throughout his Psalms. Psalm 23 is one of the verses that stands out to me like a blinking light. Psalm 23, verse 5, you prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup overflows. And so again, I want to talk about Matthew. I don't want to project this onto you, but when I would read these verses, this is literally what I would picture. I'd picture a long table. The Lord invites me as his beloved son to sit down, and an amazing feast. And I, again, if I lose somebody here, I'm sorry. When I think of a feast, I think of the movie Hook. It was a great Peter Pan movie back in the day, and they had this imaginary feast, but it turned into a real feast. Anyway, that's what I usually think of, and there's turkey and chicken and mac and cheese and all the fixins, but my enemies are way on the other end, and they just watch me dig in, and while I'm digging in, Jesus is rubbing my shoulders and just telling me everything's going to be okay, and they're starving on the other end. I'm just like, hey, this is how it looks. When I'm blessed, you are humiliated, but you get to watch me. Anybody know what I'm talking about? You get to watch me be blessed at the table. I think David kind of had a similar idea. And so, but there's a lot of enemy verbiage. Matthew chapter 5, verse 43 through 45. You have heard it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. So Jesus is going back and referencing the Old Testament multiple times. This was the foundation of Old Testament law, okay? to love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But then Jesus says, I say, love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be the sons of your Father who is in heaven. Okay, David says, I'm anointed in the presence of my enemies. But then Jesus says, this whole time up until my day, you've been taught, love your neighbor, hate your enemy. Now I tell you, love your enemies, pray for those who persecute you. Why? Well, if you really want to be considered sons of God, this is like 101 right here. You got to learn how to love your enemies. And in Romans 5, Paul really leans into this. And what he does, he puts us all on the same playing field. In Romans 5, verse 10, he says, for if, while we were God's enemies, we were reconciled to him through the death of his son, how much more, having been reconciled, shall we be saved through his life? Okay, so David, you prepare a table for me in the presence of my enemies. Jesus says, love your enemies. Paul says, we all are enemies. Well, my gosh, what in the world? What are we supposed to do with this? There's enemies everywhere. But you keep with Paul, and then you get in Colossians 1. And I want to particularly look here in verses 19, a few verses here. God was pleased to have all of his fullness dwell in him, Jesus, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether things on earth or things in heaven, by making peace through his blood shed on the cross. Verse 21. Once you were alienated from God and were enemies. There's that word again, but then he brings amazing clarity. You were enemies in your own minds because of your evil behavior. But now he has reconciled you by Christ's physical body through death to present you holy in his sight, without blemish and free from accusation. Did you see that? Once you were alienated from God and were enemies in your own minds. So, everyone watching, listening, here in the building, we all once were enemies of God. How are we enemies? In our own minds. And then it connects to why? Because of your evil behavior. So in other words, our behavior created this imaginary wedge in our minds that disqualified us from feeling like we had any access to God. Okay, well, he's a holy God, and I'm doing things that are terrible, and so I must be his enemy. Are you hearing what I'm saying? So the point I want to make is that we all first approach God as his enemy, not on his part, but on our part. Because the truth is, God has no enemies. To be an enemy with someone else, there has to be two opposing parties. I was sharing this last week, and I actually shared this even in Nicaragua, and the response was very interesting. You can't make me your enemy. That's something I have to choose, right? You have to have two opposing parties to be truly enemies. So, like Megan, for example, if I just got up here and said, okay, Megan is my enemy, I can't stand her anymore, and that's that. And you go to her, and she says, I love him. I have no issue with him whatsoever. You wouldn't say we're enemies. You would say, I have an issue. Hey, he's got a problem. Because she is not willing to be his enemy. So if you're not participating, you can't be enemies. Now look at God. Look at what Paul says. We've all been alienated from God. We've all been enemies in our own minds because of our behavior. So you approach God. God, I know you hate me. God, I know that you've brought me through all that. I know that you're the one that killed my parents. I know that you're the one that did this and that. And then God just is sitting there and he's got arms open, loving you unconditionally, pouring grace and mercy on you because you can't make him be your enemy. It's not going to happen. I know the thoughts I have for you, says the Lord. I know the plans I have for you. I've loved you before you got here to make a mistake. Nothing has changed that. You can be my enemy as much as you want, but you can't make me be your enemy. It's not going to happen. So there's still a place for you at the table. Come on. Come on and sit down. You see that chair right there? It's got your name on the back of it. Just go ahead and have a seat. You may not even receive me as father yet, but that's okay. That's all right. I shared a quote earlier this week on Facebook. I said, if you're afraid of God, continue to run to him until you receive him as father. At some point, you're going to encounter him as father. And a lot of times we have to run through the levels of our deception, the levels of our own making. We have made God out to be someone he is not. And I would say, is it any wonder why we consider ourselves enemies of God? And then when we realize he has no enemies, the next question we have to ask is, well, then why do we have enemies? Jesus is the standard. God is our Father. Why do we have enemies? Well, I've already given you a secret to that. The only way you have an enemy in your life is if you give them permission to be an enemy. If you take the posture of an enemy, well, then now you're enemies. But if you just keep loving on them, I hate you. Well, you know what? I love you. That's what Jesus is saying. Pray for those that persecute you. Love those that hate you. He is telling us in very direct terms, we do not posture ourselves as enemies. We're not going to do it. Just not going to do it. All right? Blaise Pascal, I love this quote, Jesus came to tell men that they have no enemies but themselves. Jesus came to tell men they have no enemies but themselves. And so if we could, I would submit if we could just really pull back all the layers, all the facades, and we could see the table of God for what it is, we'd be amazed. Because we'd find it as equally represented by who we would consider the family of God and the enemies of God, all sitting at the same table. Why? Because the founder of the feast has no enemies. Are you hearing what I'm saying? See, we're the ones that get hung up on the minors instead of the majors, okay? What do I mean by that? When we say that, okay, sin came into the world through one man, right? And all sinned. And then we say, but the gift is not like the trespass. The gift is greater than the trespass. And so what does Jesus do? He actually releases righteousness to all men. So we oftentimes, based on the messages we preach and the gospel that we declare, we believe the sin of Adam has greater power than the righteousness of Jesus, right? Because we have no problem, do we, Miss Flora, being convinced that everyone sins. But then the very verse that says, now the all are made righteous through the work of Jesus, we said, well, that's not exactly how that works, because there are things you got to do first to be righteous. Even though we're told in multiple places, there's at least 10 verses that say righteousness is the gift of God. You don't earn righteousness. Now you grow into righteousness, right? What is righteousness? The back wall, beloved son, beloved daughter of an always good father. Listen, God is your good father if you don't believe it, if you don't receive him, and even if you hate him. Doesn't change that he's your father. That's what I'm saying. If you're afraid of him, run to him until you see him as father. As much as it would break my heart, if my boys came to me today and said, Dad, we don't receive you as a father anymore. Listen, they can say it till they're blue in the face. It doesn't change one thing. I'm still your dad. I still love you. That hurts. Are you okay? If there's one of the many layers that the parable of the prodigal sons teach us, it teaches us that God has a heart for everyone. He has a heart for the one that runs, the one that stays. And he's asking us, will you have the heart for the ones that run and the ones that stay? And the ones that stay, I would humbly submit, he's probably talking about the Judaizers. He's talking about those that grew up in the house of God with all the prophetic promises of God. The Messiah is going to come. We stayed in the house, and they still didn't have the heart of the Father because they got upset as soon as he celebrated those who were lost coming back home, right? And then, even then, the Father doesn't rebuke the son that stayed home. Did you ever notice that in the parable? No, he says, listen, all that I have is yours. You've been here the whole time. Anytime you want to party, just throw it. Let's go. God is always generous, always eager for us to enjoy who he is. We're the ones that get hung up on, well, who has the right to enjoy him? Who has the right to be blessed by him? Right? When God I want everybody to be blessed, everybody to be loved. And can you trust me, the Father, to take care of them? Can you trust me to help them with their hangups and issues?
Thank you so much for watching. I pray that it's been a blessing to you. I just want to mention to you the importance of being a partner support here at our show. I think you can agree we all need more peace, love, and joy in the world, and most of us are looking for love in all the wrong places. Your partnership ensures that we take the so good to be true gospel to millions of people around the world. Do me a favor and go to hesterministries.org/TV to give your gift of support today. Thank you so much. God bless you, and we'll see you next week.